The Urinary System, From Blood to Urine, narrated by Alex Flood, instructor for Central California School of Continuing Education. The components of the urinary system. These consist of the kidneys. You have two. Their role is to produce urine. The kidneys lead to the ureters, which transport the urine away from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder serves as a storage reservoir until the urine is excreted from the body. Urine travels from the bladder through the urethra to the outside world. The urethra is a tubular structure that carries the urine from the urinary bladder to outside of the body. The kidneys are the main organ of the urinary system. They do the filtration that the urinary system is tasked with. They're located between thoracic vertebra number 12 and lumbar vertebra number 3. You have one on either side of the spine. They are located in the retroperitoneal space. They're large bean-shaped organs with a indention in the center called a hilum that allows the renal arteries and veins as well as the ureters to come into and out of the kidneys. The right kidney is displaced slightly lower than the left. This is due to the liver's placement in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen. The liver is a large organ and it displaces the kidney slightly lower on the right side. The renal fascia is a connective tissue that holds the kidneys in their place. Functions of the kidneys. The kidneys function to filter nitrogenous waste to form urine. About 200 quarts of blood are filtered every day to form 2 quarts of urine. The goal here is to maintain proper balance of water, electrolytes, sodium and potassium, as well as acids. The secondary function of the kidneys is to control the release of hormones into the bloodstream, specifically renin, enzymatic hormone important in adjusting blood pressure, erythropoietin, a hormone that stimulates red blood cell production in the bone marrow, and calciferol, an active form of vitamin D necessary for the absorption of calcium from the intestines. Lastly, to degrade and eliminate hormones from the bloodstream. Anatomy of the major organs, the male urinary system, top to bottom here. So along the midline of the body, we have our aorta and the vena cava, specifically in this image, the inferior vena cava, shown in blue along the midline, the aorta shown in red. Blood is traveling superior to inferior along the aorta, and along the vena cava, blood travels from the inferior aspect to the superior aspect, going back towards the heart. The easy way to remember the difference between arteries and veins: arteries will always carry blood away from the heart, veins will always carry blood towards the heart. The arteries and veins that feed the kidneys are referred to as renal arteries and veins. Shown here, the left renal artery enters the left kidney. The right renal artery enters the right kidney. Left renal vein entering the left kidney. Right renal vein entering the right kidney. Those are the vessels that deliver blood to and take blood away from the kidneys to for the filtration process. Shown as a yellow color here, the ureters. The ureters transform the processed urine down to the urinary bladder for storage and excretion. As I stated, the kidneys are large bean-shaped organs. Seated atop the kidneys are the adrenal glands. Once the urine is formed, as I stated, it enters the renal pelvis, moves down the ureters, and enters the bladder on the posterior inferior aspect of the bladder, shown here and here. The urinary bladder, as I stated, serves as a storage reservoir for urine until the micturition reflex is triggered and we are stimulated to urinate. This is the male's urinary system, slightly different than the female's, which is coming up. The male urinary system has another gland associated. This is the prostate gland. The prostate gland is associated with the reproductive system, but it does in fact surround the urethra in the males. This is one of the pathologies to be concerned with about the aging male, which is enlargement of the prostate or cancers of the prostate. The urethra in males is longer, and the urethra is the tubular structure that carries urine from the bladder to the outside world. Lastly, the urinary meatus serves as the opening in which urine comes out of. So in crude terms, the urinary meatus can be referred to as the pee hole. Female urinary system. Same basic structures here. One kidney on either side, renal arteries, renal veins feeding the kidneys and taking blood away from the kidneys, adrenal glands seated atop the kidneys, right kidney lower than left, ureters carrying the urine from the formed urine from the kidneys down to the urinary bladder. The difference in anatomy here is that there is in females a uterus, which is posterior to the bladder, meaning that the bladder sits anterior to the uterus, and vagina. The urinary meatus will be anterior to the vagina, to the vaginal opening. Urine production. Urine production begins at the in the renal cortex, where we take blood and we form what's called filtrate from the blood. So blood enters the kidneys through the right and left renal arteries. Shown here in red, the renal arteries branch, and they branch and become small arterioles, which continually carry the blood up between these triangular shaped structures. These triangular shaped structures are called renal pyramids. In between those renal pyramids, the arterioles and venules come up and down from those from the cortex of the kidneys, and we refer to those passageways as renal columns. So the pathway that the arterioles and venules travel up and down between the renal pyramids are referred to as renal columns. In the cortex of the kidneys, the outside layer of the kidneys, the arterioles carry the blood and continue to branch until they become small enough to be called capillaries. Small bundles of capillaries called glomeruli for plural, are what actually do the filtration of the blood, which we'll see on the next slide. The functional unit of the kidneys, the nephron coming up, resides mostly in the cortex of the kidneys, but you'll see coming up here that there is some of the structure that does dip down into the medulla, which is the lighter pink inner layer of the kidneys. So the glomerulus, glomerulus is singular, the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, also known as the Bowman capsule. The Bowman capsule is this capsule of the renal tubule that wraps around the bundle of capillaries that we've referred to as a glomerulus. So blood passes through the glomeruli, plural. The glomerular capsule surrounds each glomerulus, and the renal tubule is continuous, as in attached to the renal capsule. Note that the renal capsule is made of a single layer of cells. We would refer to this as being simple. Simple tissue is single layered. Blood enters through the afferent arteriole. Afferent meaning moving towards the structure in question, which is the glomerulus, excuse me. The efferent arteriole carries the blood away from the glomerulus. Now there's a difference here. There's a difference in the diameter of the afferent and efferent arterioles. The afferent arteriole has a larger, wider diameter than the efferent arteriole. And what that does is creates an increase in pressure in here in the glomerulus. We will look at the term later on, but it's called filtration pressure. So the large diameter of the afferent arteriole and the smaller, relatively smaller diameter of the efferent arteriole creates a high pressure inside of the glomerulus. This causes substances like sugar, water, urea, and other waste products, as well as salts, to perfuse from the glomerulus through the walls of the glomerular capsule into the renal tubule, creating what's called filtrate. Through the renal tubule, the filtrate is carried away from the glomerulus, and this is step 1 of the filtration process, called glomerular filtration. So 3 steps in the formation of urine. We just described glomerular filtration here, where the afferent arteriole carries blood into the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole carries the blood away. The pressure difference from one side to the other pushes substances out of the capillary, the bundled capillaries here, and into the glomerular capsule. That's stage 1. Stage 2, called tubular reabsorption, is where we reabsorb sugar and salts, and water follows by osmosis. Step 3, tubular secretion. So stage 2 and stage 1 are things, stage 1 is coming from the blood into the renal tubule. Stage 2 is coming from the tubule back into the bloodstream, resupplying the bloodstream with the lost sugars and lost water that we otherwise would need, as well as salts. Step 3, tubular secretion, is putting things that were in excess back into the renal tubules. Things such as excess acids, potassiums, and drugs. Notice the venules and capillaries and arterioles all sit surrounding the renal tubule. The renal tubules and capillary vessels and venules and arterioles are selectively permeable depending on certain levels of chemicals in our body, and that's how our body controls how much comes back into and out of the renal tubules, ultimately collecting to form the final processed urine. So urine ends up being about 95% water, 5% waste. Those are things like urea, creatinine, salts, acids, and drugs. The nephrons, the functional unit of the kidney. You have approximately 1 million nephrons per kidney. This whole structure is the nephron. So let's describe the process here. We have the afferent arteriole carrying blood into the glomerulus. The glomerulus surrounded by the Bowman capsule. We've talked about the pressure that pushes the substances out of the glomerulus into the Bowman capsule and ultimately into the ureters. Notice the efferent arteriole being surrounding the renal tubule, and this is where we have the processes of reabsorption and tubular secretion taking place. This whole structure called the nephron. The proximal, as in the end of the tubule closest to the Bowman capsule, is referred to this structure as the proximal convoluted tubule, followed by this deep dipping loop that dips down into the renal medulla, referred to as the nephron loop or Henle's loop. Distally, the tubule becomes coiled again. We refer to this as the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule joins with a collecting tubule, which has a larger diameter and has other attachments to the other nephrons nearby. Those collecting tubules come down through the renal pyramids, these triangular shaped structures outlined by the arterioles here. Down through the renal pyramids, the collecting tubules descend, and the formed processed urine collects in these collection cup regions called calyces. Minor calyces refer to the smaller structures. Major calyces refer to the larger structures that come together to form, that are formed from the minor calyces. All major and minor calyces ultimately lead to the renal pelvis, which is this collecting point here in the hilar area of the kidneys that collects the formed urine, and the formed urine then travels down the ureters to the urinary bladder. Calyces, spelled with a Y or an I, are small cup-like regions of the renal pelvis. The term comes from the Greek calyx, meaning a cup or case surrounding a flower bud. The ureters themselves, one for each kidney. They transport urine from the renal pelvis to the urinary bladder. They descend from the renal pelvis and enter the urinary bladder on the posterior inferior surface. The walls of the ureters are three-layered. The outer layer is a fibrous coat consisting of fibrous connective tissue, followed by a middle layer called the muscular layer consisting of smooth muscle. The function here is peristaltic in its nature, which is to propel the urine through the ureters using a, I like to describe it as a toothpaste tube squeezing motion to push the urine down with gravity towards the urinary bladder. The mucosa is the inner layer. This serves as a slippery coating on the inside of the tube, allowing urine to flow freely. This also protects the cells on the surface of the inner lumen of the vessel. The urinary bladder, located in the pelvic cavity, serves as a temporary storage reservoir for urine. Size and shape will vary, so that will vary the amount of urine it can contain, and this is dependent on pressure from surrounding organs. A great example of this is late-stage pregnancy, when the fetus being inverted pushes with its head on the urinary bladder, and often the pregnant female will complain of urges to urinate frequently and constant urge to urinate. The layers of the urinary bladder, very similar to the ureters themselves, at least in some regards. There's a mucosal membrane on the inside of the bladder, so we're going from inside to outside, consisting of a mucous membrane called the mucosa. Rugae are the term for the folds that occur when the bladder is empty and allow the bladder to expand as it fills. The submucosa is a connective tissue layer with elastic fibers. Surrounding all of that is the layer called the muscularis, composed of smooth muscle interwoven in all directions, collectively all called the detrusor muscle, and a contraction of that muscle expels urine from the bladder. The trigone is an area formed by the three openings in the floor of the urinary bladder. So you have two openings from the ureters, where the ureters enter on the inferior posterior aspect of the bladder. They are covered by small flaps of mucosa. The third opening is formed from the urethra. A band of detrusor muscle encircles this opening, and this forms what's called the internal urethral sphincter. The urethra itself is a thin-walled tube conveying urine from the urinary bladder to outside of the body. Sphincters that control flow of urine through the urethra. There's two. The internal urethral sphincter on the floor of the bladder surrounds the urethra where it leaves the urinary bladder. This is consisting of smooth, as in involuntary muscle. We don't have control over that muscle. When we feel the urge to urinate and we feel that contraction of our bladder, we consciously hold back the urine from our external urethral sphincter, where our internal urethral sphincter is just relaxed and allowing ready to let urine come out. The conscious control again comes from the external urethral sphincter, which encircles the urethra where it passes through the pelvic floor. This consists of skeletal muscle. This is why we have voluntary control over it. We do have voluntary control over our skeletal muscle. We do not have voluntary control over our smooth muscle, similar in its concept to the muscles of your intestines, where we can't control the way food and liquids pass through our intestines. That's all involuntary. Final notes on the filtration process. Glomerular filtration. As I mentioned earlier, there's a pressure that pushes the blood through. Some of that pressure just comes from our blood pressure in general, but there is some aid there. As I mentioned earlier, the afferent arteriole coming into the glomerulus is large when compared to the efferent arteriole leaving the glomerulus, and this creates a pressure differential inside of the glomerulus, aiding in that filtration pressure. Filtrate is the fluid that enters the capsule, the glomerular capsule, and blood flows through the kidneys at a rate of approximately 1,200 milliliters per minute, 1,200 milliliters, just over a liter per minute. The filtration membrane acts as a barrier, preventing blood cells and protein molecules from entering the capsule. Reabsorption. In about a 24-hour period, we filter approximately 180 liters, 45 gallons of filtrate through our kidneys. We create, this is where it starts to get interesting, we create 180 liters of filtrate every day, but we only urinate about 1 to 2 liters of urine per day. So we're putting back, roughly 178, 179 liters back into our body in a 24-hour period. For reference, we have about 5 liters of blood in our body. So it's safe to say that if we did not have, if evolution did not come up with this tubular reabsorption, we wouldn't have a very good way of bringing the fluid we lose back into our body. So it's interesting that we don't control, our body doesn't control the glomerular filtration rate. It does that on the back end by just bringing the fluids back into the body. It allows the glomerulus to filter those fluids out of the body, fluids and other substances such as sugars and salts back out of the body, and we do bring them back in at a later time. That's the tubular reabsorption. Movement of substances from filtrate in the kidney tubules into the blood changes the volume and composition of the filtrate. So bringing fluids back into the body to, for example, bring sugar levels back to normal, or bring fluid levels back to normal to, for example, maintain pH balance of our body, as well as things like blood pressure. The substances that are useful to the body are reabsorbed. Substances such as glucose, water, and sodium. All excess wastes will remain in the filtrate and be excreted as urine. A good example of why we would urinate more during tubular reabsorption, if we, for example, had an excess of glucose in our bloodstream. Normally glucose moves back into the bloodstream during this tubular reabsorption process, and water follows by osmosis. If we already have an excess of sugar in our bloodstream, the sugar wouldn't move from the filtrate back into the bloodstream, and thereby water would not move back into the bloodstream by osmosis. So this is an explanation of why diabetics will complain of frequent urination, excess urine output, and a constant thirst, because their sugar levels in their bloodstream are staying high, and this is not allowing the tubular reabsorption to put sugar and water back into the body. So they end up just urinating out excess water and excess sugar because it remains in the filtrate and ends up coming down through the renal pyramids, into the calyces, into the renal pelvis, draining down the ureters into the bladder and out of the body. The amount of reabsorption that takes place varies depending on which part of the nephron you're talking about. The proximal convoluted tubule closest to the Bowman capsule is responsible for the majority, about 65% of tubular reabsorption. The loop of Henle is approximately responsible for 15% of reabsorption, and the distal convoluted tubule, the final, roughly 19% of reabsorption. That leaves about 1% to be excreted as urine. And we lose about, of the roughly 180 liters, we lose about 1 to 2 liters per day as urine. Tubular secretion is stage 3 in that process, as we talked about. This is the transport of molecules and ions into the filtrate from the blood. The waste products of cellular metabolism, example given is urea, will become toxic to the body if they're allowed to accumulate. So those are lost in the tubular secretion. This is moving from the blood into the renal tubules, as well as certain drugs, hydrogen ions, potassium ions, creatinine, and histamine all move from the bloodstream into the renal tubule during step 3, tubular secretion. The urine, the final urine, consists of substances that are filtered minus the substances that are reabsorbed in the tubules, plus the substances that are added by tubular secretion. How does our body regulate this? So this is regulation of urine concentration and volume. It's typically all done by, for the most part, by hormones. The first here is aldosterone, secreted by the adrenal gland. This acts on the kidney tubules, increasing reabsorption of sodium. This is interesting. It's another osmotic process. When sodium is reabsorbed, water follows by osmosis, reducing urine output. So more sodium back into the bloodstream equals more water back into the bloodstream equals less water leaving the body as urine. It's a way to conserve water and sodium to, for example, bring blood pressure levels back up. ADH, antidiuretic hormone. This is a hormone released from the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, if you remember, is the master gland of the endocrine system. The ADH released into the bloodstream in higher levels, presence of ADH, equals less water lost from the body. This makes the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts more permeable to water. So more water is going to move back out of the tubules back into the bloodstream. The absence of ADH makes those tubules less permeable, and that equals more water lost from the body. Atrial natriuretic hormone, also called Atriopeptin, is produced by cells in the atrium of the heart, specifically the right atrium of the heart. This promotes excretion of sodium and water, and it acts on kidney tubules, inhibiting secretion of ADH, renin, and aldosterone. The act is to decrease blood volume and blood pressure. Renin is an enzyme produced by the kidneys. It's secreted in response to low blood pressure and decreased blood sodium concentrations. This promotes the production of angiotensin II in the blood. Angiotensin II is a vasoconstrictor which increases blood pressure and stimulates the adrenal gland to secrete aldosterone, and this acts on the kidney tubules, as if you remember, to conserve sodium and water. It conserves sodium, bringing water back by osmosis. The action of this angiotensin II is to increase blood volume and consequently increase blood pressure. Lastly, the final step in this whole process is urination. Our term for urination is micturition, the act of expelling urine from the bladder. The bladder can hold approximately 1 liter of urine, 1,000 milliliters of urine. The reflex for micturition is triggered when the bladder contains anywhere from 2 to 400 milliliters of urine. The reflex is stimulated by stretch receptors in the bladder wall, triggering the micturition reflex. There's an automatic response from the bladder to contract. The internal urethral sphincter relaxes, and we can consciously control our external urethral sphincter to prevent urination in incontinence. Urinary incontinence. Impulses are then transmitted to the detrusor muscle, the muscle that contracts the bladder, and these can be inhibited or stimulated by higher brain centers. So we can think thoughts about not peeing and hold our urine, or we can think thoughts about urinating and urinate. This completes the slideshow on the urinary system from blood to urine.